Millionaire CEO calls to fire. Single mom. Then her daughter answers and says, "Please don't. Before we begin this emotional journey, tell me, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it there right now? Drop it in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels." Jonathan Blake had built his empire on control, precision, and an unshakable discipline that made him both feared and respected in every boardroom he entered. Yet that morning, all of it seemed to unravel with the push of one simple button. Call. For 15 consecutive days, the cleaner's name had haunted his reports, marked with a red absent that irritated his order-bound mind, especially when Rachel Moore had given no explanation. He didn't have the patience for excuses or human error. In his world, business was cold, and so was he. He remembered her only faintly. A quiet woman with tired eyes who never spoke unless spoken to. Someone who moved through the halls like a shadow with a broom in hand and silence trailing her like a veil. He hadn't noticed her absence until it had started affecting his spotless office routines, and now he'd had enough. Anger simmered in his voice as he snatched the receiver, determined to end her employment personally. The line rang 3 times before a voice, softer than he expected, answered. "Hello?" It wasn't her. It was a little girl, probably no more than 8, her tone fragile, like a leaf trembling in wind. Jonathan didn't slow down. "Where's your mother?" he barked, not caring who he was speaking to. There was a pause, the kind that lingers before a storm. She can't talk right now, sir," came the small reply, one laced with worry, exhaustion, and a kind of bravery he wasn't ready for. He leaned forward, colder now. "Tell her she's fired," he snapped, his voice cutting like ice through the receiver, already preparing to hang up and move on with his day. But before the phone reached the cradle, her voice cracked. Not with volume, but with pain so raw it made the world around him stop. "Please don't," she whispered, like a secret too heavy to carry. Jonathan froze, the anger draining from his face as he pressed the phone back to his ear. "Mommy didn't mean to disappear," she continued, her breath hitching. "She's very sick, sir. She doesn't open her eyes much anymore. I try to feed her soup, but we ran out last week." The words hit him harder than any boardroom attack ever had. "She cries every night because we can't afford food anymore." That sentence didn't just shake him. It broke something inside. He couldn't remember the last time anyone spoke to him like that. Not with fear, not with anger, but with a child's raw desperation. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't manipulative. It was just the truth. The sound of her breathing through the receiver filled the space between them, and for the first time in years, Jonathan Blake didn't know what to say. He imagined her sitting by a silent mother, clutching a phone too big for her hands, fighting the weight of a world that should never belong on such small shoulders. The man who had once walked away from a friend's funeral without blinking now sat paralyzed by the voice of a little girl he'd never met. The silence stretched, and all he could hear was the haunting fragility in that, "Please don't." He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. In his pristine office filled with glass, chrome, and success, Jonathan felt the bitter taste of shame creep into his throat. He had called to erase a name from a payroll, but instead found himself answering for a heartless world. He glanced at the reports on his desk, graphs, profits, promotions, all meaningless now. He clenched the edge of his desk with trembling fingers, suddenly feeling the weight of his title pressed down like never before. That voice, so gentle, so brave, refused to leave his ears. It was a sound that didn't belong in this kind of cruelty. It belonged in safety, in warmth, in laughter. And yet it was here, pleading with the man who was about to make things worse. The power in his hands suddenly felt like poison. He swallowed hard, looking out the window at the city skyline, wondering how many more Emilys were hidden behind brick walls and broken windows. The phone was still pressed to his ear, his breath now shallow. She hadn't spoken again. Maybe she was waiting. Maybe she was crying. Maybe she had already lost hope. But Jonathan couldn't hang up. Something deep inside him, something buried for years under success and pride, stirred violently. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like a CEO. He felt like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, realizing what kind of person he had become. And on the other side of that call was a chance to be something more. As the silence grew heavier, a single tear escaped his eye and slid down his cheek. He whispered almost inaudibly, "What's your name, sweetheart?" And the story that would change both their lives forever had just begun. "I'm coming there," Jonathan whispered, barely recognizing the softness in his own voice. And for a moment, he forgot the weight of his title, the schedule packed with meetings, the polished image he wore like armor. All that existed now was the sound of a little girl named Emily clinging to hope through a broken telephone line. He didn't wait for a reply. He ended the call with trembling hands, grabbed his coat, and left his high-rise office without a word to his assistant, whose eyes widened at the sight of the ever-composed CEO moving like a man on the edge of panic. Inside his sleek, chauffeur-driven car, Jonathan's heart pounded against his chest as if trying to fight its way free. Guilt gnawed at him, hollowing out every defense he had built over decades of ruthless business. He stared out the tinted windows, watching luxury blur into poverty as the car left downtown behind and slipped into neighborhoods he hadn't visited since childhood. The address Emily had given was in a part of the city no one from his world ever dared to speak of. Forgotten buildings, sagging roofs, cracked sidewalks, and weary souls. As they pulled up to the crumbling apartment complex, Jonathan hesitated for the first time in years. This wasn't just unfamiliar. It was humbling. The building looked like it could sigh under its own weight. A rusted staircase creaked under his polished shoes as he climbed, passing neighbors who stared with confusion and suspicion. On the third floor, he stopped in front of apartment 3B, its paint chipped, door slightly ajar, and a small, makeshift welcome sign drawn in crayon taped crookedly to the wood. He knocked gently. The door opened with a slow creak, and there she was, Emily, a fragile girl with tangled blonde curls, oversized socks, and the kind of smile that was used to hiding sadness. She didn't say anything at first. She just looked up at him, blue eyes wide with both wonder and fear, then quietly stepped aside to let him in. The room was small, dimly lit by a flickering lamp, and smelled faintly of medicine and dust. A worn couch sagged beneath an old blanket, and a cracked window let in more wind than light. Jonathan stepped in cautiously, taking in the poverty around him. Not just the lack of things, but the absence of comfort, of safety, of warmth. "She's in there," Emily whispered, pointing to a bedroom door that stood slightly ajar. Jonathan nodded and walked toward it, each step feeling heavier. Inside the room, Rachel lay motionless on a thin mattress, her face pale, lips dry, eyes closed as if locked in a dream too deep to escape. An oxygen mask lay unused beside her, and an empty bowl rested on the nightstand. Emily followed him in, sitting beside her mother, gently brushing her fingers through her mom's tangled hair. "She gets colder at night," Emily said, her voice barely above a breath. Jonathan knelt beside the bed, unsure of what to do, unsure of how to carry the weight of what he was witnessing. "Have you called a doctor?" he asked softly. Emily shook her head. "We don't have a phone plan anymore. I used the neighbor's line when I saw your number." Jonathan felt a lump rise in his throat. "How long has she been like this?" "3 weeks," she said. "At first she tried to get up, but then she stopped trying." Emily picked up a storybook from the floor and held it tightly. "I read to her every night. She likes the princess parts, even if she can't hear me." Jonathan looked at the book, its cover torn, pages curled from use. "Do you have anyone else?" he asked. "No," she replied. "It's just me and Mommy." Jonathan's gaze fell to Rachel again, her chest rising slowly with effort, her fingers twitching as Emily stroked them gently. The woman he had almost fired was fighting for her life in silence, in darkness, without anyone to see her pain. "You're very brave," he said to Emily, and she shrugged. "Mommy says being strong isn't about not crying. It's about still trying when you're scared." Those words gutted him. Jonathan turned to the door, pulled out his phone, and called his private physician, barking urgent instructions. He didn't care about protocol or appointments. Someone was coming now. Then he called his driver and told him to return with food, warm blankets, and anything else that could fit in the back seat. Emily watched him with wide eyes, unsure whether to believe what was happening. "Is she going to be okay?" she asked, her lip trembling. Jonathan knelt in front of her, placing a hand on her shoulder. She will be, he promised, and for the first time in years, he meant every word. As the sirens of the approaching ambulance echoed down the street, Emily whispered something that stayed with him. You sound different now, sir, like someone who can hear people's hearts. And as Rachel was lifted onto a stretcher, still unconscious but now cared for, Jonathan realized that the cracked voice of a little girl hadn't just asked him for help. It had shattered the walls around his own soul and let the light in. As the echo of Emily's whispered words lingered in the silence, Jonathan remained crouched beside the frail woman, whose body barely stirred beneath the thin blanket, her breath shallow like a flickering candle fighting the wind. The child's quiet bravery contrasted so painfully with her surroundings that Jonathan felt like an intruder in a sacred space of suffering and strength, a place where hope still stubbornly lived in the most broken corners. Emily sat cross-legged on the floor, hugging her knees with the same arms that had carried far too much responsibility for someone so small. The air in the apartment was stale, heavy with unspoken stories, and every peeling wall seemed to carry a silent scream. Jonathan took in the room, a shelf with expired medicine, a cracked picture frame of Rachel holding baby Emily, a makeshift curtain fashioned from an old sheet, and a tiny calendar with the days crossed off in a child's handwriting. He realized Rachel hadn't just been sick. She had been silently drowning while no one noticed. Emily picked up the cloth again and wiped the already clean table, her hands trembling, as if scrubbing away reality itself. You shouldn't have to do this, Jonathan said, his voice low, and Emily looked up with tired eyes that had seen more than any child ever should. Mommy always cleaned when she was sad. I guess I do it too now. Jonathan swallowed hard, feeling like the floor beneath him might cave in from the weight of guilt. He had nearly erased this family with a single decision born of frustration and ignorance, and now here he was, looking at the pieces he had almost shattered beyond repair. Rachel's fingers twitched as if reaching for a dream, and Jonathan instinctively held her hand, surprised at how cold it was. I didn't know, he whispered, though the words felt pitiful, too small to cover the damage his indifference had caused. Emily sat beside him now, her teddy bear tucked under one arm, and gently tucked her mother's hair behind her ear. Sometimes I sing to her, she said, almost embarrassed. It helps her sleep better. Jonathan nodded, unable to find words that could carry the weight of what he felt. It wasn't just sorrow, it was shame, a piercing regret that clawed at the foundation of the man he thought he was. He stood slowly, scanning the apartment again, taking note of everything. The broken heater, the empty refrigerator, the worn-out shoes by the door. This wasn't just a visit anymore. This was a wake-up call. Emily followed his gaze and quietly added, Mommy said we shouldn't ask for help unless it's really bad, but she got worse so fast. Her voice cracked. I didn't know who else to call. Jonathan knelt beside her again, taking her tiny hand in his. You called the right person, he said gently, though the irony stung. He pulled out his phone and started making calls. One to his private doctor, another to a contractor, a third to his driver who was already on the way with supplies, each command laced not with obligation, but with urgency and remorse. Emily watched him closely, as if unsure whether to trust this sudden change, but something in her eyes softened. Are you really going to help us? She asked, almost in a whisper. Jonathan looked at her, his jaw tight, eyes glossy. I should have helped you a long time ago. At that moment, the doctor arrived, quickly moving to assess Rachel's condition, while Jonathan stepped aside, his fists clenched at his sides, helpless but desperate to fix what he had ignored. He noticed Emily quietly folding her mother's clothes in a corner, trying to keep things tidy despite the chaos, and it struck him. She was more than brave. She was the glue holding her family together, with invisible threads no one else could see. When the doctor explained that Rachel would need immediate hospitalization and long-term care, Jonathan didn't blink. Do whatever it takes, he ordered. As Rachel was carefully lifted onto a stretcher, Emily reached out and kissed her forehead. I'll take care of everything, Mommy, I promise, she whispered, and Jonathan felt something twist deep inside him, a yearning to protect, to restore, to atone. The ambulance lights flickered across the cracked walls as the gurney wheeled out. Emily turned to Jonathan, her voice still soft but steadier now. "Do you think she'll smile again?" He bent down, touched her shoulder, and replied, "Yes, sweetheart, and you'll never have to carry this alone again." As they stepped into the night, Emily holding his hand for the first time, Jonathan knew this wasn't charity, it was redemption. And that apartment would no longer be remembered for suffering, but for the moment when everything began to change. The hospital walls were painted in soft colors, meant to calm the soul, but nothing could quiet the storm inside Jonathan as he sat in the waiting room, watching Emily curl into the armchair beside him, her head resting on his suit jacket like it was a pillow made of safety she never had. The hum of machines and muffled footsteps echoed down the corridor, a quiet symphony of worry and hope. And Jonathan, the man who once ruled boardrooms with ice in his veins, now sat helpless, staring into the past he didn't know was about to confront him. A nurse approached, kind but hesitant, holding a thick manila folder with Rachel's name scribbled across the front. "We thought you should see this. You're listed as her emergency contact," she said. He took it with a nod, unaware that everything he believed about Rachel and himself was about to shatter. With trembling hands, he opened the file, scanning the documents at first casually, then urgently, as words and dates began to pierce through his memory. Transcripts, awards, scholarships. She had once been brilliant, a business prodigy, the kind of mind every CEO would kill to have on their team. Then he found it, a photo of a younger Rachel, glowing with determination and a spark in her eyes that made his stomach drop. He'd seen those eyes before. The memory hit like a freight train. His fingers flipped faster now, desperation growing. Internship forms, Blake Enterprises logo, her signature. Then came the dagger, a draft proposal titled Integrated Local Efficiency Strategy. Jonathan's breath hitched. That exact strategy had saved his company 6 years ago. It was hailed as his brainchild. The board had praised his vision, investors had tripled their support, and competitors scrambled to catch up. All because of a plan he now realized hadn't come from him at all. He closed his eyes as the truth sunk in like cement around his chest. Under pressure to deliver results, he'd taken the proposal from an intern whose name he'd barely remembered, convincing himself she'd left and would never notice. He had buried the ethics of it beneath ambition, letting greed wear a mask of necessity. But now the universe had led him back to her. Not through a lawsuit or revenge, but through a daughter's desperate voice begging for her mother's dignity. Jonathan leaned forward, elbows on knees, pressing his palms to his eyes as shame surged through him like wildfire. He felt exposed, like a fraud in the one place where titles didn't matter and character couldn't hide. He looked over at Emily, sleeping soundly for the first time in days, unaware that her mother's sacrifices had quietly built an empire for a man who had forgotten what it meant to be human. The folder lay open on his lap, mocking him with every word he had once overlooked. How could he have been so blind? Rachel had once stood on the brink of greatness, then disappeared into obscurity to raise her daughter alone. Not because she failed, but because she chose love over legacy. And he, drunk on success, had built that legacy with her stolen spark. He could feel the crushing weight of it now, not just as a businessman, but as a man. The cost of silence, the toll of pride, the damage of walking past brilliance because it was hidden behind humility. His phone vibrated, a board member asking about a meeting, but he ignored it. None of that mattered anymore. Not the stock value, not the quarterly targets, not the applause he once bathed in. All that mattered was the woman in ICU and the child who had unknowingly reopened his soul. He rose and walked to the window, staring out into the city skyline that once symbolized power, but now looked like a house of cards built on someone else's dream. A tear slid down his cheek as he whispered, "Rachel, I'm sorry. I don't deserve forgiveness, but I promise I'll make it right." He turned back to Emily, pulling the jacket over her shoulders as she stirred and mumbled, "Is Mommy gonna be okay?" He knelt beside her, voice choked but firm. "She will be, and so will you. I owe her more than the world will ever know." At that moment, a nurse peeked in, giving a hopeful nod. She's stable. You can see her soon. Jonathan nodded, placing the folder on the seat beside him, like a confession laid bare, and stood with renewed purpose, not to cover his guilt with charity, but to rebuild something real, starting with truth, humility, and a promise made not in a boardroom, but in a hospital hallway, beside a child who unknowingly taught a millionaire how to be a man again. Jonathan followed the nurse through the long corridor, heart pounding like a drum echoing in an empty hall, unsure what words would be enough when he faced the woman whose dreams he once buried beneath ambition. The hospital room was still, bathed in soft golden light spilling through the window, as if the sun itself had chosen to witness this moment. Rachel lay there, fragile but no longer fading, her chest rising steadily, her fingers twitching as if clinging to the edge of consciousness. He stepped closer, every footfall heavy with regret and responsibility, and stood in silence, watching the woman who once held a future so bright it could have lit cities, a future he had dimmed without even knowing her pain. Her eyelids fluttered open slowly, dazed and searching, until her gaze found him, and in that second, 100 unspoken memories passed between them. Jonathan swallowed hard, then offered a soft, unsure smile as he extended the flowers trembling in his grasp. "Hi, Rachel," he whispered, her brows furrowed in confusion, but recognition followed as if something long buried was clawing its way back. She tried to speak, but her voice cracked. He moved closer, eyes glassy. "I failed you, years ago, and I can never take that back. But I swear to you, I won't fail your daughter. Not now. Not ever." She blinked, trying to comprehend the emotion pouring out of the man she once knew only as a towering figure at the top of the corporate world. He reached into his pocket and placed a letter on the table. An official job offer, her name printed boldly as executive assistant to the CEO, with a full benefits package, housing included, and a generous salary that honored her worth. "You're not going back to cleaning halls," he said. "You belong beside me, where you always deserve to be." Tears slid from Rachel's eyes, not from weakness, but from a release years in the making. At that moment, the door burst open and Emily ran in, cheeks pink with excitement, her arms full of juice boxes from the nurse's station. "Mommy," she squealed, "he said we're going to have a house with stairs, and I get my own room and my own books, and a puppy maybe." Rachel smiled weakly, her arms trembling as she reached for her daughter. Jonathan stepped back, watching them with a reverence he'd never known before. Two souls who had weathered storms and still managed to shine. As Emily curled up beside her mother on the hospital bed, Jonathan knelt beside them both, taking Rachel's hand gently. "No more silence," he promised. "No more nights wondering how you'll get through. You gave up everything for love. Let me give it all back, not as charity, but as gratitude." Days turned into weeks, and Rachel's health improved rapidly under the warmth of care she never dared hope for. Jonathan kept his word. He bought them a beautiful home on a quiet street. Not a mansion, but a place filled with light, laughter, and a backyard where Emily could finally learn to ride a bike. She began attending a private school where she discovered a love for science and storytelling. Her imagination finally allowed to flourish beyond survival. Rachel joined Jonathan at the office, walking through the front doors not with a mop, but with dignity, respect, and the title she had long earned. She brought new ideas to the company, created mentoring programs for single mothers, and redesigned employee support policies from the inside out. She wasn't just working there, she was changing it. And Jonathan? He changed too. No longer driven by numbers alone, he became a man shaped by compassion, purpose, and the lessons carved into him by a child's voice that still echoed in his heart. Every Sunday without fail, they gathered at the same table, Jonathan, Rachel, and Emily, not as boss, employee, and dependent, but as something far more sacred, a family stitched together by pain, truth, and second chances. They laughed over burnt toast, danced in the living room to old records, and built traditions that didn't come from bloodlines, but from shared healing. On Emily's birthday, Jonathan gifted her a telescope with a note that read, "For the girl who saw light even in the dark." Rachel framed it, And on quiet evenings when the world slowed down, Jonathan often sat by the window, watching Emily play in the yard, and whispered to himself. It all began with a phone call. What he had tried to end out of frustration had become the very beginning of everything he never knew he needed. One soft voice, trembling with love, had saved a mother, awakened a man, and built a home where none had existed. And in that truth, Jonathan finally found peace, not in wealth, but in the redemption only love could write. The cruel call that began with a threat ended as a story of grace, of healing, of how sometimes the most powerful business decision you'll ever make is simply choosing to listen